Phil, would you mind just muting everybody again? Okay. All right. So let's get started. We're really honored to be joined by Congresswoman Betty McCollum from the 4th District of Minnesota, who's also the chair of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense, which is who's introduced really historic legislation having to do with United States aid and the rights of Palestinian children. And I want to get into the legislation specifically, but I thought perhaps I might start in a slightly more personal place, if you don't mind, Congresswoman McCollum. This issue of Israel-Palestine, I think it's fair to say, is not an issue that all of your colleagues are particularly eager to jump into. So I would love to know a little bit about your journey to becoming a leader on this question of Palestinian human rights. What it was that led you ultimately to, what were the experiences that led you to decide to take this issue on? Oh, sorry, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah,
I wasn't after you asked everybody to be muted. So we're good now. Thank you.
Yes, we're great. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to do that when I'm chairing meetings all the time. There's
Yeah.
a couple of members in particular, you're still muted. So, well, thank you for including me in your salon. There's different group settings that people refer to, but we're big fans in my office of reading a lot of the things that you've published. So this is a treat for me too to be with you. So thank you so much. You asked about my journey. Well, it's interesting because you could say I grew up as a child kind of in the middle of religious disputes, having a Lutheran mother and a Catholic father back in the 50s when that wasn't popular, and both sides of the family would at times make very cruel comments. And then I have a very strong Irish background, and kind of watching what was going on in Northern Ireland. And Minnesota was involved in bringing children from Northern Ireland. Protestant children would stay with Catholic families, and Catholic children would stay with Protestant families here. And it was all about giving children a chance to not be so wrapped into this intergenerational turmoil of not liking the other, and understanding that there is places for peace. So when I got elected to Congress, the opportunity to travel and go places that I did in the Middle East and around. I've been to Yemen, I've been to Syria, been to Iraq, Jordan, Tunisia, Algeria, all places that I had only seen on a map as a social studies geography teacher, right? And to get to go there and really see the struggles that families were facing. So I got involved in working on how do we promote girls to go to school? How do we stop ending child marriage? And then how do we make sure that kids have an opportunity to grow up with success and opportunity? So in 2006, I had my first vote in committee. I was on the International House Foreign Relations Committee, and they had a Palestinian Anti-Terrorism Act of 2006. And I had religious organizations here in the Twin Cities and hospitals here in the Twin Cities, which partnered in the Palestinian occupied area with providing healthcare. And they explained to me how this bill would be cutting off them being able to provide, in some cases, life-saving treatments for cancer drugs, and that for children, that this was a step too far. So I was one of two people who voted against it. And it started out with a call from a member of AIPAC who I knew, calling my chief of staff and calling me a terrorist. We fought back on that. And then to fast forward,
Tamar.
I had some folks who came in and were telling my chief of staff about what was going on in the Palestinian Authority of children being taken from their homes at night, hooded, taken to military detention centers in Israel. No parent with them, no legal recourse and the actions that happened with them. And I just said that this does not express an American value. So we sent a letter to Senator Kerry, and that kind of started from there. And then we started writing legislation to work on it, and gathered support of members, interested members in Congress who now will talk about this. And then to the bill that I introduced right now, which as one of your viewers mentioned, J Street is now supporting in over 150 different organizations, and that's to stop the detention of children to be sent to military detention centers within Israel, working on stopping the demolition of homes and making sure that U.S. tax dollars are spent in a way that promotes dignity and promotes respect and recognizes human rights.
Thank you for that. And I also just want to tell folks that I'm going to ask the first bunch of questions, but please feel free to put questions in the chat and I will convey some of them to Congresswoman McCollum. Obviously, for many members of Congress, I think it's fair to say the politics of this issue are really daunting. So you talked about your human rights concerns more generally and how they applied here. But I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about what it was like for you thinking about the process of really diving in on the deep end of an issue where the politics can be so fraught.
Well, it's fraught for many different reasons, and I'll take it to an experience that I watched growing up as a child, and that would be Northern Ireland. So my father, when I got old enough, started talking about what was going on in Northern Ireland and how the bars here in St. Paul would have two chip jars, one for the IRA and one for the barkeep. And so he decided early on to speak loudly about, some of the terroristic activities that were going on in Northern Ireland and refused to participate and said we need to work on a peace process. And that was very, very controversial here in the Twin Cities. And it divided Catholic families. And, whole arguments and terrible things would happen. So I know when I started working on this, that some of the same discussions were taking place within the Jewish community. And sometimes everyone wants everything to be quiet, no one else to talk about it. And it's not for outsiders to get involved. So I knew as I became more involved in this issue that I was, possibly putting myself in a place where I could be criticized on both sides and find that I'd have very little help. But I found just the opposite with the support from outside groups, human rights organizations within Israel who reached out to us, conversations that I had with the Jewish community here in the Twin Cities and around the country to say, no, we do need to talk about this. We do need transparency. We do need to figure out how to move forward if we're actually going to ever achieve a peace process. So good for you for creating a spot in which to have conversations. So we knew it was going to be controversial, and it continues to be controversial. We've had groups just in the last election, take out political ads when I was running for my re-election to Congress saying that I'm more dangerous than ISIS because of my support for Palestinian terrorists, which is not true. I can't let the bullies silence me. And so I'm just so thrilled that we have so many folks from all over the world, including in Israel, supporting, bringing attention to this so that we can focus on human rights, which is something that I think the United States still is working on here, right? We've got challenges right now with voting rights and, entrenched racism and other things here at home that we're dealing with. I've worked on Native American issues most of my adult political career, and still the prejudice and not wanting to talk about the genocide that happened here in the United States. So these are controversial issues, but if we don't talk about them, if folks like who you have gathered don't talk about them, then they get swept under the rug and we don't move forward.
I'd love to know, since you must talk to your colleagues about these issues a lot, and your sense of, among those who are not where you are on this issue, which is unfortunately, I think most of them, probably, at least publicly, your sense of the variety of motives that would lead members who might be progressive on other issues to not be more progressive on this. How much of it is genuine conviction that they just don't see the issue the same way that you do? How much of it is their political concern? What's your sense of what are those conversations like when one is talking with members behind closed doors?
You know, it's probably a combination of both. People not knowing what's going on. Here in the United States, we're terrible about being engaged in international news, and that's not any different for members of Congress. So it's who talked to them last, you know, if they appeared something was a credible source, not looking to see if there's another source that backs that up, or to delve into it deeper, or to even find out the history of what got us where we are today. You know, Americans aren't very curious about other people's history. It's a very, very, very sad thing. And I also think the fear of being called anti-Semitic. You know, I grew up after World War II. I know, you know, I've read Anne Frank, you know, in grade school, and just watched the horrific things that happened to Jews in Europe, and even what we did in our country with not allowing the refugees in. I mean, the discrimination is still an alive well today. And so people get caught up in that thinking by criticizing the actions of the Israeli government somehow, that they could be seen and viewed as being anti-Semitic. And that's not the case. But it's very hard for some people to kind of pull that apart and feel comfortable with that, because the attacks do come. As I pointed out, the attacks even come towards me. So it's if you can avoid putting yourself in, you know, in front of a place where you know you're going to be attacked, members quite often do, because you're getting attacked on all sides for other issues. So it can be hard to engage people, but members are becoming more and more engaged on this issue and asking more questions.
Steve put a question in the chat asking, what arguments do you find are most successful when you're talking to your colleagues and trying to break through some of that that lack of knowledge, or perhaps that prism that makes it very difficult for them to imagine any criticism of Israel that is not an attack on Jews?
Right. I think focusing on what's happening with children. And I'll use an American example. Most people here in the United States did not know, because we don't teach it in our history books, what happened to Native Americans, how Native American children were forced from their homes, they were sent to schools, they were not allowed to speak their language, the young men had their hair cut, all the things trying to make them conform and to change, and that's a hateful part of our history. Most Americans don't know it. And when they do know it, their attitude towards why we still find problems on reservations and how we still don't live up to our treaty rights. We have more and more members of Congress becoming engaged in that as they become more aware of our sort of history with the first Americans. And so I went with a basis of talking about children. Especially when I was just mortified when I heard what, you know, a fellow democracy, an ally government, Israel was doing with putting children in military detention, getting signatures signed in Hebrew, which these children don't speak. It's not their language. They don't read or speak it. Finding out that parents weren't allowed to go in. Watching some of the arrests take place in the schools where people are coming in full military gear and then pulling a child out. That creates, you know, intergenerational terrorism, violence that doesn't move the next generation to want to reach out and embrace peace. And so I figured we could agree that we could say to an ally, a democracy, this needs to stop. We can agree that this shouldn't be happening. And I figured we could agree on children, I found out that that's much harder than I thought it was going to be. But I think what people are understanding and seeing, because it's being covered in the news, is what's happening with the settlements. And that's why I was happy to work with all the great partners that we have, the over 150 different faith-based organizations, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, human rights groups, on talking about what's happening with the settlements. Because if children don't have a place to live, if they don't have a school to go to, we're also creating intergenerational trauma and not creating an opportunity for those kids to even feel that they have any hope and opportunity in their future. And that's not good for Israel.
We have a question from George, which is about the treatment of Ilhan Omar. One could also mention Rashida Tlaib as well. Do you think you are treated differently than they are, because they're both Muslim and Ilhan Omar is also Black? Do you think that impacts the way they're perceived? And I wonder if what your thoughts are about the way they're perceived and treated inside the Democratic kind of caucus in Congress.
So the fact that they're Muslim and the fact that they're women of color makes them very popular targets for the Republican National Committee. I mean, they're all about fear. They're all about fearing the other. So they're happy to use them in an ad to create fear, to take words out of context, and to constantly go after them. And once in a while, AOC, I usually refer to as Alexandria, but I wanted people to know who I was talking about. Alexandria is in one of the ads. Sometimes I'm in one of the ads with them too. But it really does. They really do focus on using women of color, that they're somehow less than American, that they don't have the right to speak. So that's playing to their who they think is their political base and how they raise money and how they get out the vote to be fearful. And that's just something we have to recognize, and that's wrong, but that's what the Republican Party has done, and we see it. You've all seen it, I'm sure, nationally in the ads that run every 2 years. Within the Democratic caucus, there is space for conversation. There's asking people to explain things. I see people sit on the floor with Rashida all the time, asking about what it's like in Palestine. People were very worried about the safety of her family during the last incident with Hamas wrongly shelling Israel, and with the Israelis, with what they did with bringing down buildings and buildings that had press corps in it, everything. People were very concerned in having conversations with her about it. I also think it's also an intergenerational thing. I grew up, with my experiences and the way that I engage people in talking about human rights. I'm 66 years old. These are young women who have a whole different background and the way that they engage in talking about things. So we have, I think, rightly so, different ways we approach things. But that's just the way that they choose to engage their followers. And we see a whole young generation of activists here in the United States, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's working on stopping some of the environmental degradation, things that are going on. And they have a very different way in which they want to engage and be heard. And so I think some of it is also intergenerational.
But just to press a little more, I mean, we now seen again a whole group of members, Democrats coming out with a letter criticizing Ilhan Omar, and even leadership kind of again. Do you think that the caucus has treated her fairly? How do you think that they have responded to the pressure that they get around her and to the controversies, or some might say, quote unquote, controversies that have been associated with her?
Well, Ilhan's my twin sister. We're from the Twin Cities. And as I pointed out, I'm older, and little sisters don't like big sisters talking for them all the time. So I think some of that is better asked how Ilhan feels that she's on. Ilhan, I've talked with this a little bit. She did put out another correction, and I think she's very, very much wanting to, make sure that her words aren't taken out of context. People don't put their interpretation on what she said and what she meant. And as I said in my tweet, she has every right to speak as a member of Congress. But I really think that the RNCC, and that comes back to Minnesota, Tom Emmer is the head of that. He's represents a district in Minnesota, is using this as a lightning rod to cause division. And maybe it is spilling over into our caucus. But, they've been able, the Republicans, we're no longer talking about Marjorie Greene anymore, right? They've created, a way to talk about Ilhan and women of color and Muslims to go back to their base. We in the Democratic caucus should not allow that to divide us.
You mentioned generational divides. I'm interested in whether you see that among Democrats in Congress. Do you find that younger Democrats in Congress tend to have a different perspective on this than older members, or not so?
I think they've campaigned on the issue. There are members of Congress who are older than I am, who are very supportive of working on this issue, not afraid to talk about this issue. Many of them are members on our bill. But I'll tell you, the younger members who are coming in, they're like, no, I campaigned on this. I talked about this. This is something that my constituents know I'm going to stand up for. And so they're more quickly engaged in getting involved.
So I wanted to turn to the bill in particular. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about what the legislation you've introduced about the rights of Palestinian children and U.S. aid. Just explain to us what it would do.
So, I mean, you know the facts about how many children are detained, the violence that they encounter in these detention centers, and Israel operates two separate but totally unequal justice systems, and so we're pointing that out in the bill, and then what we're trying to do is make sure that none of our tax dollars are going towards the detention of these children, or are tearing down Palestinian homes, the forced removal of Palestinians from their land. And so the bill, in its essence, kind of points that out, that this is a value that as Americans, we do not want to see children being detained in military detention centers. And so the bill starts creating transparency. So there is a substantial amount of money that goes to the Israeli government, it's cash, and there isn't an audit done on it. So what we're just saying is, Israeli government, we would like to see an audit done on this money to make sure not one penny is going to the detention of these children, which we think is wrong, and for removing people from their homes and ripping their homes down and destroying schools. We think that that's wrong. So we're trying to bring transparency and shed some light on this, as well as educate colleagues and people all around the United States about what is going on in this very, very unequal system of justice that Palestinians are facing.
And so who then would do the audit to figure out how the U.S. Aid was being spent and what it was doing?
Well, it's an organization called the GAO, and it's a general accounting office. They would submit an annual report, and we have them do reports all the time. We haven't had a report at this level of Israeli funding since 1991, and I think it's long overdue. And we do it for other governments that we give money to all the time. I work on all kinds of humanitarian things, whether it's wildlife trafficking, whether it was a PEPFAR bill, what we work on maternal child health. We ask for detailed accounting to to make sure that the money is going where we want it to go to make a positive change in people's lives.
So let's say it turns out that some U.S. Aid is going to has been used to purchase some military equipment, or somebody involved with some Israeli military unit that was involved in the demolition of a home, let's say. Then what? Then what would the bill do at that point?
Well, the bill would show that that's happening. And I think the majority of members of Congress would say, no, our aid is not to be used in that way. And then we could start being more prescriptive in future legislation and holding how our aid dollars are spent accountable. But first we need to know, right? Right now we don't even know. So once we know, I've been sitting too still. Everybody, I'm going to do my jumping jack and try to get the light back on in here. There we go. Thank you. We don't have any transparency right now, and sunlight is a great disinfectant, and I want to spread some sunlight on how this money is being spent.
So the bill itself would not then cut off that aid. It would basically just provide the transparency so that then Congress would have the opportunity to take some future action if it wanted.
Absolutely, and we should, and I believe we will.
So it's interesting because I think the bill is often described as conditioning aid or restricting it, but it sounds to me more like it simply monitors where the aid is going rather than actually cutting it off if it is being used for a particular thing.
We don't want money being used for that. So if they want us, I would say that, we should be conditioning aid, that our aid is not used for the military detention of children, destroying homes, destroying schools in the Palestinian occupied area. But right now, we can't say that's actually happening because we're not doing an audit on any of the spending.
Right.
So that the report back is, oh, that's not happening. Okay. We ask other governments to verify that. We're going to ask a fellow democracy to verify it.
What's been how many co-sponsors do you have now, and would you say has been the response from members?
We have 26 right now, and we had a couple join us during this last work break. Members are becoming more engaged in it. I think the fact that we have church groups, interfaith groups going in together, talking about what this bill really does do and what this bill doesn't do, so we don't allow other people, the bullies, to describe what we're doing here, has made a huge difference. J Street has been very helpful in helping us, open more doors to talk about what's going on. But there have been human rights groups, both within Israel and here in the United States, and some internationally, that have been working on this for a long time. And now people are paying attention because they don't see how we're going to achieve peace in the Middle East with the spread of settlements and with intergenerational trauma that is taking place now, especially with Palestinian children.
And have you gotten any response from the Biden administration?
I haven't had direct conversations with them yet. I anticipate that I will be now that we have the budgets coming out and working on things. I've been a lot of the aid money is in the State and Foreign Operations bill, and so conversations with Barbara Lee from California will be very important.
And there's no Senate equivalent of the bill at this point. Is that right? Are there conversations about creating a Senate version?
Every once in a while we hear about a senator that's interested, and the groups are talking to folks, and then we don't see anything come of it. But that's not going to stop us from raising awareness and creating hope and opportunity that we can have transparency in how taxpayers' dollars are being spent, and that they aren't being spent to demolish homes and to imprison children.
So there's been a lot of discussion in the media over the last month or so about the idea that there's been a significant shift in American politics on this issue. I wonder, just seeing it from inside Congress, do you feel like there's been a significant shift? since this recent round of violence? Do you feel like there are members that you knew who are thinking and speaking differently than they were before, or do you think that's a bit perhaps overblown?
I think two things have happened that have really engaged members to kind of pause. One is realizing with the constant expansion of settlements and the demolishing of homes that the two-state solution that they like to talk about that they support is on life support. And what does that mean? Well, then the other thing that kind of is a pause for alarm is more members of Congress are finding out in Israel, the nation state law being passed, which gave different, more rights to Jewish Israeli citizens than Arab Israeli citizens. And as we're dealing with our racial injustices, our racial inequities, what's still kind of going on with voting right here, right? And the work that Congress is doing to rectify past wrongs with Native Americans is kind of like, okay, this doesn't settle with me very well. And so members are becoming more engaged. And then quite frankly, the press is covering more about what's happening. People are seeing the kind of lives and lack of opportunity people in the occupied Palestinian area have.
We have a question from Alan. Alan asks, how are children defined in the proposed legislation? He says that Palestinian teenagers may be involved in activities that could be defined as terrorist or violent activities, and may be compelled, he suggests, by Hamas to participate. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, how children is defined, and what about the idea if there are Palestinians who were, I guess, younger than 18 who were involved in activities that would be violent and might even be classified as terrorism?
Well, first we have to get them out of the military detention system and put them into a civil court where a judge and prosecutors and defense folks with full transparency can talk about the activities that these children were engaged in. We have that here in the United States. And so if a 16-year-old commits a heinous crime, they're tried as an adult. But what we're seeing and what people are witnessing are children, who were either throwing a rock or standing next to somebody who threw a rock, who in the middle of the night, don't get a knock on the door. They get the door broken down, and the Israeli soldiers come in, put them, cuff their arms in the back, put them in a military vehicle, and drive them off to a military prison. And that is not any form of justice that I don't think any of us in good faith could justify and say is fair, is equitable, and really is serving the cause of justice. It's creating more injustice, and it's creating intergenerational trauma for that whole neighborhood, for the school that child attended, and for the family. And that is not good for Israel.
I assume that all the co-sponsors are Democrats. Have you seen any possibility that there are Republicans in Congress who are open to these conversations?
There were a few Republicans that were having conversations with me. There are two that still are, but they have their own internal mess going on with not even recognizing that it was a fair and free election, and denying what happened on January 6th. They have so many other problems within their own party right now that, quite frankly, they're not looking to get engaged in another conversation or legislation that's going to even draw more ire on them. Because as you see, and as I said earlier, the Republican National Party uses my legislation and uses, Rashida and, the Muslim ban, all of that. It's just complicated. But, at some point, you're elected to do a job. And, we've all had jobs where, if somebody was asking you to do something that you thought went against who you were as a human being, or went against the principles of what you thought you should be doing in that job, you quit, you leave, or you stand up. And that's what we need to have members of the Republican Party start doing, and stop taking their lead from the former president, who doesn't live in reality and is filled with hate and rage.
Yeah, yeah. You've talked a couple times about the two-state solution and the threat that settlements, pose to it. Obviously, there are folks, and one of them who've suggested it may be time to think beyond the two-state solution. I think Rashida Tlaib is, as far as I know, the only member of Congress who takes that position. I'm curious in whether you think about the possibility, how you think about what would be your metric for determining that the two-state solution was no longer viable, and at what point you might be open to considering other alternatives like one binational state or confederation or something like that.
Well, it would be up to the Palestinian people, not up to me. As I said, I work on Native American issues, and we now have a couple of tribally enrolled members in Congress, but not a large proportion. And I never speak for the Native American tribes. I try to project what they want to see happen. And that has been my work. I'm working on this issue. Rashida and I have had some conversations. I totally respect Rashida's right to talk about this. She has a whole different, she has family who lives there. So if she's reflecting the views of family members and people that she knows over there, she has every right to reflect that and make her case for that. I don't have that kind of a background. I don't think that it's up for me to decide the autonomy for the Palestinian people. But I will say this: it can't be a Jim Crow-like system. It can't be separate and unequal. It shouldn't even be separate and equal. It should be one cohesive government that respects and protects the rights of all.
We have a couple of questions which kind of ask why not go further than the kind of monitoring, and why not simply start conditioning U.S. aid right now, or even potentially cutting some elements of U.S. aid as a way of pressuring the Israeli government to, for instance, stop building settlements or stop the blockade of Gaza or something like that.
I'm an idealist in that I am going to work hard for peace. I'm going to work hard that everyone, whether they're Palestinian, Jewish, American, Northern Ireland, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, that they are treated with dignity and respect. And that's hard work. I'm also a pragmatist, and I live in the real world. I have 26 dynamic, brave, wonderful co-sponsors in our legislation, and other groups that are working to move it. One of the things I have to do is I have to count votes. And so what I'm doing is I'm working with people like yourselves to build a movement, to build the opportunity to have a discussion with facts behind it, with full transparency, with full disclosure about what's happening, and then we can move forward for the next step. I could draft a bill to do that. It's not going to pass. It's not going to have a hearing, but we want to create an opportunity for people to engage and have a conversation. And the conversation is, don't you think you have the right to know how your tax dollars are being spent? And if you don't want your taxpayers' dollars being spent this way, then we need to have transparency. And once we have the transparency, I think the conversation changes.
We also we have a question from Lynn about Iran, and how I'm interested in how optimistic you are, how you would evaluate the Biden administration's policies on Iran and returning to the Iran nuclear deal since they had entered, and what your sense is about the kind of mood in Congress about being willing to fight again for the Iran nuclear deal.
Boy, I mean, that was a real, I'm going to say it this way, drag down knockout fight within our caucus. And I was privileged enough to work with the Obama team to work and engage with members with facts about what was going on. What President Trump did, well, you can use your own, you can come up with your own private word on it. I'm not gonna use improper language on this chat. I think I think Democrats are engaged in doing something. I don't think the Republicans want to help us at all. And I don't know, I haven't gotten a real flavor for what's going on in the Senate, but I do know that the Biden administration would like to get talks going again. But here again, people didn't stick to the facts on it, especially the Republicans about the way payments were handled and a whole bunch of things. And in Iran, the fact that Iran and Saudi Arabia are talking to each other now, I find rather interesting. So maybe the dynamics on that changes, and where we have countries in the Middle East coming together to work with us to solve this, as well as European Union nations. People aren't real eager, to be honest, to get in this space again, but at the same time, we know we need to do something. And so I stand ready and willing to help in any way I can to get the talks moving forward. We need to talk to each other. I mean, if the Trump administration could talk to the Taliban and not even include the Afghan government in what they were moving towards for withdrawal, certainly, we should be able to talk with colleagues about Iran, and that includes other nations.
It makes me think of another question, perhaps even more controversial than the U.S. talking with Iran, which is at some point pointed out that if the United States is talking to the Taliban, why do we still not think it's possible for us to talk to Hamas? And so I'm curious how you think about that.
Well, right now, the Palestinians haven't had a good election. The way that things were handled after Hamas won the election is in the past. Hamas is considered a terrorist organization, and they behave in that way towards Israel. And back channel talks can take place, and maybe you get people to a place where there can be some negotiators put forward that people can trust to move forward on that. But right now, we need to see new leadership, both in Israel and new leadership in the Palestinian Authority, in order to have meaningful conversations moving forward. Right now, we have the extremes with Hamas and the extremes within the Israeli government creating havoc and chaos for people both in Israel and the Palestinian area who would like to see peace and prosperity move forward. And we have to get the extremes out of it, and we need to get new voices engaged in this discussion.
I appreciate it. I recognize that a bunch of the questions I'm asking you are probably, difficult questions, because they push even further, in some ways beyond what the very courageous, difficult positions you've already taken. But there are very few members of Congress, I think, even would engage with them as openly as you have, which, I think is to your great credit. But there was another question which had to do with the use by Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem of this term apartheid. And I'm just interested in whether you think that, the question from Jennifer is whether you think that use of that language has had an impact in Congress. Has it had a role in shifting people's perceptions at all?
It's had a role in polarizing people.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the groups using it and how it's used. It's used to its extremes. It's not used as a definition. So if you look at apartheid as creating two systems that aren't equal, where one group has more power over another group, I think people would say, yeah, I mean, that's what's happening in the Palestinian Authority area, and we're disturbed to see what happened in Israel when the Knesset passed the nation state law. So it is a polarizing word, as when people use genocide, and people tend to want to go to one extreme or the other and not allow people to have a conversation about what are we really talking about here. So it is creating conversation, but it also can be harmful to a conversation. The last time I was in Israel, I was watching these roads being built that were going directly to the settlements, and I went, okay, that's not good. Roads, hospitals in an area that would only take, Israeli settlers, and health clinics that are only Israeli settlers could go, surrounded by other areas. And, it reminded me of being a young child, hearing about how, African Americans in the Deep South would be, involved in a car accident or in the middle of an early delivery and would go to a hospital and be turned away. I mean, that's just wrong.
I was fascinated at the very beginning by you talking about your experience with Northern Ireland, and also the debate among people in the Irish diaspora about Northern Ireland. And I would just love to return to that and ask you what lessons you think there are from the experience of what's happened in Northern Ireland, and also from the way in which Northern Ireland was so deeply interconnected with the identity of many Irish Catholic Americans.
Yeah. Well, when Northern Ireland got partitioned off, that was going to create peace. And it didn't, because the autonomy of the people who lived on the other part of Ireland, they weren't included. And the festering of Christian, I'm going to say Christian, Catholic versus Protestant, is still very real yet today. And I say that as a Catholic who fights against all the injustices and holds a deep conviction that my church is definitely not perfect, but I'm going to stay in and fight to try to make it perfect by exposing the wrongs in it. So when it comes to Northern Ireland, the Irish who, thought the attacks were wrong, especially some of the bombings that were taking place in London, were afraid to speak out, because then it was like, well, you're agreeing with the Protestants then. And those just aren't, it shouldn't be about religion. It should be about human rights. And I'll leave you with this story. So with the last time I was in Northern Ireland, there were two things that one thing I found powerfully uplifting. And that is, there was a group of mothers that had their children, Protestant Catholic mothers that had their children dancing together. And the Protestant kids came out and they did their dance. And then the Irish Catholic kids came out and they did their dance. And then it was planned this way. And then at the end, the majority of the dancing, because they had their plaids on, the majority of the dancing was mixing everything together. The whole room was shaking with people clapping and tapping, and everybody was just happy and exuberant about the kids. And then I went out in one of the cities outside of Belfast, and there's still this big wall up. And I said to one of the former Sinn Féin members, I said, why haven't you taken that wall down? And my takeaway from that was, there were people who knew that they had a little bit of power still kind of going on, and people were consulting them on the struggles and the troubles, as long as that wall was up. Hey, what do you think we should do about it? What do you want? They didn't want to let go of the little bit of power and prestige that they used to have, that was being taken away from them if a full, reconciliation were to happen. And that was very troubling to me. And as you can see, there's still struggles in Northern Ireland because there hasn't been a full reconciliation in truth. And Brexit just made things worse because the economy was picking up for both Protestants and Catholics, and they were both starting to kind of function as one unit under the euro with Ireland. And as you see, the international community has been very engaged in trying to make sure, including the US, that doesn't fester open again. So I know these aren't easy questions to handle with easy answers on them, but you can't walk away from them.
Yeah. I just want again to tell folks that they can put questions in the chat if they have other questions they'd like to answer. I'm interested in you talked a little bit about you were just talking about the Irish Catholic community. I'm wondering what advice, what you've learned in terms of your interaction with the organized American Jewish community around this issue that has helped you navigate it. It's obviously, as you know very well, the Jewish community is not monolithic, and yet often the most powerful voices are the kinds of voices that would not be open to the kinds of work that you're doing. And I wonder what you've learned about navigating that community and those organizations that has helped you in this work.
I know some people just don't want to be engaged. Mm-hmm. It's uncomfortable. It becomes a family issue, and you have to respect people for how much that they think that their family or that they personally want to handle in life with getting involved on these issues. I know that Americans were very proud of the fact that we try to address inequities, disparities, and injustices, and we're still trying to form that more perfect union. So whether it's the Black Lives Matter, whether it's the work I do on Native American issues, women still aren't paid equal wages here in this country. We're seeing anti-voter discrimination laws going forward. So I know that when I have conversations, that I can't have it like just pointing a finger saying, the Israeli government's totally wrong, and you, how dare you, support that? Because there's a lot of things that go into how people arrive at the positions that they are. So I try to I'm true to my values. I stick with the facts, and I try to do so respectfully without making people feel that I'm overly judging them. There are going to be people on the extreme that are going to judge me, and at some point I will make a decision. It's not worth engaging in conversation with them anymore. But it's keeping yourself open to have the conversation, and that takes a lot of energy, and it's a lot of hard work. And I'm sure all of you have been you've been there. And some days it's like, oh, I just don't want to deal with this. I'm dealing with COVID and other things in my life. I don't need to be involved in this right now. But if we don't stay engaged, if we don't stay involved, it's only going to allow for more extremism on both sides. And it's just going to lead to more injustice, more death, more destruction, and more intergenerational trauma, which is not good for the Palestinians, and it's not good for the Israelis either.
And we're just about out of time, but I'd also be curious to ask about what your experience has been like with Palestinian community in the United States, and with Arab and Muslim communities more generally. How whether whether they have the organizational capacity to kind of to have influence in Congress, whether their opportunities to engage with Congress are met with kind of in a receptive way. Do you get the sense that there is the potential for those communities to start to be able to have organizational influence in terms of this debate in Congress?
I've watched it grow, because now people feel that they can have a conversation, that there is a safe space. They do know that they have allies in the Jewish community. They do know that that if they don't speak up and speak out, then other people are speaking for them. And I'll close with this. In 2006, after I took the vote in the committee not to vote for a bill that would cut off humanitarian aid going to hospitals and clinics, I was in the Rayburn building. My office wasn't there. And so I was going back and forth between that and the Capitol, getting ready to walk over to the Longworth building through the tunnels. And this police officer who I'd been saying hi to, he came up and he had tears in his eyes and he gave me a big hug and he said, "Thank you. Thank you for your vote today in committee. I'm Palestinian." And, you know, he said it in a way that he wasn't even going to say it, so all the other officers around him heard. And that meant he was afraid that he might not be accepted, or he would be judged, or he would be criticized. And I take that hug with me. And I take the hug that I got from the Jewish grandmothers that I met when I was in Israel, who are at the checkpoints trying to keep the soldiers' humanity in line, as they would say, so that they don't become hardened, so they don't become part of the intergenerational trauma. So I take that with me, and I take great pride in my district, that my district has my back on this. And I thank you for the work that you all are doing on this. And it's good work. As John Lewis would say, sometimes it makes for good trouble. And so thank you for letting me join you today. And I look forward to reading your columns, Peter.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Nabil, we don't have time for another question. I really apologize. But thank you, Congressman McCollum, so much for this conversation, for the really, really important work you do. For those folks on the call, next week we'll be joined by Yehuda Kurtzer, who's the representative of the Shalom Hartman Institute here in New York. Someone who's been a bit of a critic of my work, but I thought that it was important to have somebody who would offer, I think, a thoughtful criticism from a somewhat more centrist, one might say, Jewish perspective. So you'll be getting some information about that. And again, Congressman McCollum, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you.
Stay healthy.
Bye. Have a great week.
Are there centrists left anymore?